able to continue joining us. We're right smack in the middle of King Solomon's take on Simcha, on happiness. Sorry, before I do that, let me throw up onto the chat the website link, just in case anybody needs it. That's the link, again, to our website page, in case anybody wants to catch up on anything or review anything, or just enjoy my voice over and over again. So we are now discussing King Solomon is taking on the idea of simcha, of happiness, and trying to give us a sense of what that is and how we're supposed to access that and use it properly, where it's going to be most beneficial to us. And again, particularly, he's discussing the idea of happiness that comes through material possessions. And in doing this, we had the entire story behind King Solomon's method, how he went about doing that. He tried everything, literally everything, to try and get a little bit of happiness, and he walked away pretty disappointed because what he found was that no matter what he tried, no matter how much effort he put into it, he really only got a small amount of fleeting happiness, it would seem, at the time. And it wasn't anything that was satisfying for him. And because of that, he at first takes a very dark look at the world, and he says, this is it? This is all the happiness I'm going to get? Well, that's a waste of my time, and it must be worthless. And again, that's the first time that he uses this phrase that something has ein yisron, has no purpose, doesn't add anything to the world. So again, we actually saw last week that he used three negative descriptions when talking about happiness from material possessions. He said that it was hevel, that's one of our go-to words right there, right? It's fleeting, or it's like steam. He said it was ru'us ruach, that it was spirit breaking, and finally that it was ein yisron, it has no purpose. To which he self-corrects, and he says that can't be, because who am I to follow after the king and be questioning the king? And again, this is, as we pointed out last week, the first time that he actually ever mentions Hashem. He mentions God in the book of Kohelet, and he says, it can't be that it's got no purpose. That's not a wisdom way of looking at the world. And because of that, he says, I have to do some more research. So that's really kind of where we left off last week, where he's starting to do a little more research. And what we saw was that he tied it back into the concept of wisdom in general. The name of our class is the Wisdom of Solomon. So he's coming back to wisdom. And he said, the last thing we saw last week was that he says that at first, that one of the understandings that he has to come to, of understanding why would God put into this world a form of happiness that doesn't do anything for me? That, right, if all this work and all this gaining of material possessions is not going to give me any happiness, then why is it there in the creation? To which he says his first response to that is that it's there for the contrast. That's what we kind of stuck our toe in last week. And he said that the same way that we have wisdom and we have foolishness. And sometimes the foolishness is just there to show you what the wisdom is, right? We get to experience a greater understanding of wisdom when we see the opposite. And the same way how light and dark, sometimes you can't see the light, you can't appreciate the light until you have the dark. So in the same way, we have this type of simcha, this type of happiness, which is not satisfying, which is then going to be able to open up our eyes to what is satisfying happiness. That was one take on it. And this week, we're going to start going into quite a bit deeper discussion of this type of happiness. Now, what we're going to find in this week's verses is, I actually was kind of stuck with how I'm going to approach this week's verses. Usually, in one of our sessions, we'll go through about 4 to 5 verses of Kohelet. Again, we're halfway through the second chapter of Kohelet. And the problem with this week is that he's going to take a very dark turn. Okay, and we know that that's one of the things that Ecclesiastes is famous for. It's or infamous for, is it can come off as a very dark book, and he seems to go in that direction this week. But if you recall, the main idea that we're trying to come out with is that really the book is an uplifting or empowering book. It's not a happy book. No one said that, but it is empowering, and it teaches us a good way and a way to enjoy life. So we've got about 14 verses that he's going to take to get us to that point back from, but he's going to have to go a little down to come back up. So I wasn't sure exactly how to take this week's verses, and I was considering running through 14 verses and then kind of discussing it all as one group. I don't think that's the best option. So what we are going to do is I'm going to divide this piece into two parts. We're going to do one part this week and one part the next week, and hopefully we'll be able to kind of stick it through. Because again, we're going to watch him go to a dark place so that he can come out back into the light afterwards. So that's what we're going to do this week. We're going to kind of his slow descent into madness, if you will, from which we will then pick up next week, if that makes sense. So I ask you, as the members of the class, to please have patience for this kind of piece, because you're going to see him get some pretty dark, and just keep in mind that it's coming for, yes, you're welcome. Keep in mind that it's coming with the intention of getting to a point next week. Okay. So without any further ado, I'm going to share the screen and we will get started right now. Okay. Hope everyone can see that. I've got the size up pretty large. Thank you. All right. So and in fact, here's my number one proof that he's not just going to the darkness for the sake of being dark. He's not just going into a full depressive mode, because he starts off the entire thing with our verse we saw last week. I'm going to read it again, even though we did see this last week. And again, this is how we ended last week. And he says, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but again, this is where we ended last week, where he says, "V'ra'iti ani," and I have seen, sheyesh yitron lachachma min hasichlut, that there is an advantage to wisdom over foolishness, ki yitron ha'or min hachoshech, as much as there is an advantage to light over darkness. So again, we see he's prefacing the entire next piece with the understanding that wisdom is really important. Okay. Now he's going to go and take wisdom to pieces, but knowing that he's starting from the point of wisdom is greater, he's going to question that and come out in the end that it is greater, but he's going to question that first. So he does this intro statement to say where his mind is the entire time, that really wisdom is the greater. It's much greater to be wise than foolish, right? And we're going to see, connecting to that, it's much greater to be happy in a good way than happy in a bad way, or happy in a less satisfying way. He's going to tie it all back in together again. But what he's going to say, he's just prefacing and saying, we are on the side of, yes, wisdom. Go wisdom. We like wisdom. But he's now going to take you for a little bit of a ride with that. So we're going to start now with our verse 14. Again, this is chapter 2, verse 14, in which he says like this: Hechacham einav birosho. A wise man, or a wise person, has eyes in their head. V'hakesil b'choshech holech. And a foolish person walks in darkness. V'yadati, and I know, gamani, myself, I know myself, shemikra echad yikra et kulam, that one end or one occurrence will happen to both of them. Okay, and a lot of let me read that again, and we'll read that again before discussing what it means. Again, the wise person has eyes in their head, and the foolish person walks in darkness. V'yadati gamani, and I know myself, shemikra echad yikra et kulam, that one occurrence will happen to all of them. Okay, and so again, a lot of the commentaries over here, which is the basic understanding, is that this one occurrence that will happen to both of them. What's going to happen to both a wise person and a foolish person? Well, they're both going to die eventually. Okay, that's the inescapable truth of life, right? So with that being the inescapable truth of life, he looks and he says, well, listen, a wise person walks and has eyes in their head. Okay, meaning to say that they look forward to the future. They see now where they're standing right now, and they plan for the future. And the contrast is that the foolish person walks in darkness, doesn't have any plans for the future, and just keeps on walking and hoping that they're going to bump into something at the end of the day. Nonetheless, even though the wise person has the eyes in their head that's allowing them to see the future, they're going to end up with the same end in the end. They're both going to end up with the same occurrence happening to them. Again, the inevitable truth of life being that it all ends in death. So with that being the case, King Solomon is obviously going to be concerned. Hold on a second. I want to prove to you that wisdom is better than foolishness. Okay, well, take a look for a second. Wisdom can't save you from the ultimate ending, right? Wisdom, a wise person may have eyes in their head that allow them to see the future, but they're going to end up the same way as the foolish person who walks in darkness. I know myself, right? That one occurrence is going to happen to all of them. Okay, so with this verse, King Solomon is starting to explain to us why he at first is questioning why wisdom is worth your time, and he's going to continue this in the next couple verses. But he wants to question first, why is wisdom so important? I'm telling you, right, we know that King Solomon was the wisest of all humans, the wisest of all people ever to live, right? As witnessed by the prophets themselves. Why King Solomon was the wisest person to ever live, and he's questioning himself, why is wisdom so good? The same ending is going to occur to the wise person as it is to the foolish person. Okay. Just as a side point, we're going to come back to this, but it's worthwhile pointing out what the sages say on this verse. I always try to keep that also in. Again, the sages are often going on a bit of a esoteric or beyond the simple explanation of the words. They try to give us some more midrash, and here they actually say that this verse is a contrast between a lot of different people. They say, for example, that the wise person has eyes in their head is referring to Abraham, and the fool who walks in darkness is referring to Nimrod. And whereas Nimrod they were both kings, they were both great leaders of mankind, and at the end of the day, who is the one who's remembered for all of history and the founder of the religions of the world is Abraham, whereas his nemesis Nimrod was a fool who walked in darkness. Similarly, Moses and Bilam. Okay, so whereas Moses was the one who gave us the Torah, he is the ultimate prophet for the Jewish people. You have Bilam, who was the prophet for the rest of the world, and one of them has a lasting impression on the world and one of them doesn't. So obviously that's taking this verse out of its simple explanation, again, whereas the verse is clearly telling us that we have a problem with the fact that a wise person and a foolish person end up in the same way. The rabbis, the sages, do see from here a point of contrast between a number of our heroes versus a number of our antagonists throughout history. So again, with this verse over here, this is him starting to question, what is wisdom all about? If wisdom is so great, then why does the wise person and the foolish person end up in the same place? Okay, with that, we're going to move on to the next verse. And he's going to start explaining why he's so bothered by this. Va'amarti ani bilibi, and I have said to myself in my heart, Kimikre hakasil gamani yakreni, that the occurrence that will happen to the foolish person will also happen to me. And therefore, vilama chachamti ani az yoter, then why would I go ahead and be smarter? right? Again, this is his initial reaction is going to be, if I'm going to have the same end, me, right, the wisest of all mankind, I'm going to have the same end as the kasil, as the fool. So then why do I bother being so smart? V'dibarti v'libi shegan zeh havel, and I spoke to my heart and I said, you know what? I think this is another one of our fleeting things, another one of our steams. Okay. Again, this is his kind of speaking out what we said in the last verse. He's saying that based on the fact that a wise person and a foolish person end up with the same end, they're both stuck with this occurrence that's going to happen to them at the end of their life. Why do I bother being so smart? And actually, this is fitting because King Solomon was not born wisest of all mankind. He was already a wise person, but not at the level that he eventually achieved. He was actually, because of his good deeds, God granted him one wish, so to speak, kind of like a genie. I mean, not to compare God to a genie. God is very different than the concept of a genie, but God did provide King Solomon with one wish. I'll grant you one wish, whatever you want, basically. That will affect you personally. Right? I don't think he was able to ask for anything for the entire Jewish people. So with that choice, he decided, he said, I would like wisdom over gold and jewels and all the other things. And so when he did that, God said, that's a smart answer. So he was granted wisdom. He worked, so to speak, for his wisdom. He decided, he took a leap to decide that he wanted wisdom. But now he's questioning that. Why did I bother to become so smart? Again, let me read the verse all together again. Ve'amarti ani b'libi, and I have spoken, I have said to my heart, Kimikrei hakasil gam ani yikreni, that just like what will happen to the fool will happen to me. Vilama chachamti ani az yoter. If that's the case, then why am I trying to be smarter? V'dibarti v'libi, and I've spoken to my heart, shagam ze havel, that this is also one of our things that are havel, that are fleeting, like steam. Okay. An interesting point over here is also that we see that he is using this term bilibi. I've spoken to my heart. Now, we've said in the past that whenever we're talking about the heart over here, it seems to be that he's speaking from objective reasoning. So he says, objectively, wisdom is not going to get me any farther than foolishness. And at the end of the day, I can't outsmart life. So what's the purpose? Why would I want to be so smart? Okay, so we see this is his first complaint about wisdom. His first complaint about wisdom is that I'm going to end up the same way either way. So then why do I bother with wisdom? Okay, now I told you this is King Solomon taking, this is almost like a devil's advocate over here, where he's going to be going through this series of verses where he's going to be playing the other side and saying, why wisdom? Now, keep in mind, he said, wisdom is much better than foolishness. All right, so we're coming with that understanding that that's his end goal. He wants to get to the point where, yes, wisdom is greater than tomfoolery. But why is that? And he's stuck with this first question of, if wisdom and foolishness, or wisdom and foolishness, silliness, stupidity, whatever it is, if they're both going to end up, if I'm going to end up in the same place at the end of the day, why do I want to be smarter? Obviously, he has an answer. Okay. If anyone has any questions, I'm going to give a couple seconds here. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next verse. Okay. All right. Let me just scroll up. So we get this here in the center. All right. So this now is verse number 16. All right. Perek Bet, Pasuk Tet Zayin. Again, chapter 2, verse 16. And he says like this. Now, this is kind of starting it's a similar complaint about wisdom, but he is going to turn it a little different direction. And he says, well, again, his main point is wisdom is going to end up in the same place as the wise person is going to end up in the same place as the foolish person. Now that has another ramification, and that's what he's pointing out over here. Because ein zichron lechacham, there is no memory for the wise person. Im hakasil leolam, together with the foolish person forever. Okay, now that's a very strange sentence structure. We'll come back to it. But just to continue and finish the verse first. Bishekvar hayamim habaim, because before the coming days will come, or before the days will come, hakol nishkach, everything will be forgotten. Ve'ech yamut hechacham im hakasil. How could the wise person die with the foolish person? Now again, that sentence went like 3 different directions and a couple different tenses. So we'll read it all together once again, and then we'll break it up a little bit. Once again, from the top, ki ein zichron lechacham, there is no memory for the wise person. Im hakasil olam, with the foolish person forever. Bishekvar hayamim habaim, because before the days come, hakol nishkach, everything will be forgotten. Ve'ech yamut hechacham im hakasil. And how could the wise person die together with the fool? Okay, the general sense of this verse is that he's still on this issue of why is it that the wise person and the foolish person get the same end in the end of the day, but he's also starting to bring out another idea over here, which is that he's bothered by the fact that everything is going to be forgotten from the wise person. Okay, and we're going to see that more coming up in the coming verses. But it's more than just the fact that the wise person can't save themselves from the ultimate end. They can't save themselves from death. Fine. That being so, he's bothered also by another point over here, which is that what's going to last after the person is gone. So you have a wise person, great. He's got a lot of wisdom. He's got a lot to share. And let's say you explain to me why his life has purpose while he's alive. Okay, but that still doesn't explain to us what's going to last for the person afterwards. So he's bothered by this olam business, with this foreverness business, this eternity. He says before eternity comes, before the next generation comes, everything's going to be forgotten, right? And in more ways than one, the wise person will die with the fool, meaning that everything that they stand for will die with the fool also. He's now bothered. Basically, what I'm trying to say is he's bothered by a related but different point. Not just the fact that the chacham, the wise person, cannot save themselves from the end, but they also, how do they ensure a lasting impression on the world? How do they ensure that they make some sort of lasting thing in the world if everything will be forgotten? Now,
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes, please.
It's a little bit ironic that he would ask this question, being the author of this book, which we're reading, how many thousands of years later?
Right.
I mean, he's a wise man, and he left a legacy that we are enjoying today. So this is kind of a difficult argument for me to swallow.
Yeah, I will grant you that. That is definitely true. And in fact, that's kind of where I was going to go. The truth is there are a lot of wise people who are remembered, and a lot of foolish people who are remembered also. Interestingly enough, is that the wise person and the foolish person can very easily be remembered for all of history. Now, I'm always impressed by the story of Thomas Paine, right, the author of his pamphlets, Common Sense. That's a bad one to forget. Okay, so Thomas Paine was famously the author of Common Sense, which it did more towards the American dream, the dream of an America, than basically anything else printed in its time. It was had a tremendous effect on the people of the 13 colonies. Meanwhile, Thomas Paine himself lived a terrible life and died in poverty, and he died a drunk, I think, and back in England. Every dream that he had for America, he ended up not living. And so you have, interestingly enough, he was definitely a smart guy, but lived the life of a fool and ended up in the same place as the fool. strangely enough, we remember him as the wise person. And there's plenty of other people who are, we have this strange toss-up. So I will agree with you there, Jacob, that this is a strange comment for King Solomon to make. I think it's less to do with the fact that it does happen. It does happen. Some people do make a lasting impression, wise people and foolish people. The question is, how do you ensure it? How do you make sure that it's going to happen? And I think that's where his problem is. If I'm so smart, he's saying, then I should be able to figure out a way that to make sure that I make a lasting impression. Now, again, he happens to have done that. But not everyone who tries succeeds. If you go on Amazon, I do this all the time because I'm constantly in search of a good book. And I tend to like fantasy books. Well, that's very hard. It's a very hard genre to find a good book because there's every Tom, Dick, and Harry wants to write one, and there's you could find a good 1,000 trashy novels for every good one, and it's very hard. Everyone's trying to make that name. Everyone's trying to be the next J.R.R. Tolkien, right? But in reality, they can't be. How do you ensure it? King Solomon's bothered by, right? If there's no remembrance for the wise person over the fool forever, right? Before the next days come, already everything is forgotten. So how does the person make sure that they are the one who's remembered forever? That's a hard thing to do, obviously. And in fact, I would say that is an impossible thing to make sure of. It would be
I have another question.
Yeah.
Hayamim Habaim, is he talking about the days of the Mashiach, or is he talking about tomorrow?
I think he's just talking about tomorrow. That's a good question. I haven't seen anything that describes it as the end of days. Literally, it does mean the coming days. So my understanding is he just means, even in the next, even the day after the person, the wise person's trying to make something last beyond the grave. So as soon as that day is over, there's nothing promising that he's going to be able to do that. I constantly think about this. I celebrate, or whatever, I observe my father's yahrzeit every year. But then you start to think about it, and so if you observe your parents' yahrzeit, and you observe hopefully your grandparents' yahrzeit, but who's observing their parents' yahrzeit and their parents' yahrzeit? There's millions of Jews throughout history who unfortunately don't have anybody celebrating their yahrzeit for them anymore, or again, observing their yahrzeit for them. It's an impossible thing to make sure of. And it can be a saddening thought, but again, we're on the way towards finding the path towards good wisdom and good happiness. So that is how I understand his point over here, is not just how do I save myself from the ultimate end of humanity, how do I also make sure that I make a lasting impression? How do I make sure that I make a lasting impression? And that, unfortunately, many wise people die with the fool. Okay. But thank you. Great questions. Thank you for chiming in. We're going to move on to the next verse over here. And again, this is where it gets basically as dark as it's going to get, these next two verses, where he says, what was my outcome from all this? Right? I have all these questions. What's the point of wisdom? What's it all for? And he says, V'saneti et hachayim. I hate life. I have hated life. Kira alai ha'ma'aseh. Because it was bad for me, that which happened. Shena'asa tachas hashemesh, all the physical things. Ki hakol havel urut ruach. Because everything is fleeting and spirit breaking. Okay? Again, saneti, the shoresh there, the Hebrew root is this sin nun aleph. That's sin'ah. Means hatred. You may have heard the term sinat chinam, that one of the things that we're trying to constantly rectify in our exile is the baseless hatred that we unfortunately have towards one another. So that's the word over here. Sinah is hatred. He says, I've come to a point where I hate my life. V'saneti et hachayim, I hate life. Kira alai ha'ma'aseh, because it was bad for me, that action or that story, shena'asa tachat hashemesh, which has occurred, which has happened under the sun. Again, under the sun being a reference to the physical world. Ki hakol hevel urut ruach, because everything is fleeting and spirit breaking. Okay. Once again, I'm going to read the verse one more time. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. He's unfortunately in this low point from where he's going to rise back up again. So he's saying, based on everything, based on my questions about wisdom, and he has kind of veered off the track with happiness, right? In discussing happiness, he's brought up wisdom, and now he has to talk about wisdom for a little bit in order to come back to happiness. And we'll see that actually start to play out in the next verse also, where he connects the two. But again, we're going to read this verse one more time. V'saneti et hachayim. I have hated life. Hira alayha ma'aseh, because it was bad for me that which was done, or the story. Shena'asa tachat hashamesh, which was done under the sun. Ki ha'kol hevel urut ruach, because all of it is fleeting like steam and spirit breaking. Okay, I'm not going to dwell on this too long because, again, I think it's pretty self-explanatory what exactly this verse is coming to tell us. And I think it's important that we see this next verse over here also together with it, because as we saw last week, we saw that he used one word twice, one verse right after the next. And it says it was all, and we said last week it was a reconsideration. So here he's going to do the same thing. He has the same word starting out off the verse. It's not really reconsideration over here. Over here, it's more, he's extending it to our original discussion, which is happiness. And he comes up over here in verse 18, again, chapter 2, verse 18, and he says, V'saneti ani et kol amali shani amel. I have hated all of my work that I worked, tachat hashamesh, under the sun. Shani chenu la'adam shia acharoi, because I'm going to leave it all over to the person after me. Okay, now he's bringing back the idea that we started with, which is he's trying to figure out, how do I access happiness? And he goes through all this work to try to achieve every bit of possible achievable happiness in this world with physical pleasures, with material pleasure, right? So again, he says over here, I have hated all of my work, shani amel tachat hashamesh, all that work that I did under the sun, again, physical, material stuff, all that work that I put in to gathering material possessions, that's what I started to hate more than anything else, right? So I've hated, because of my questions on wisdom, and I hated wisdom. But now the corollary is that now I also have come to hate all that work that I did to achieve, to bring in all those material possessions. Because, and this is the key point over here, I'm going to leave it over to the next person. And we've all questioned this at some point in our life, is, wait, so we're all doing this to get enough money, to have enough money, to leave it over to the next generation? What's the point of all that? I would assume every human being has questioned that at least one point in their life, right? Am I going to gather it all together just to leave it over to the next generation? And he says that's a major point that's concerning him. Because again, as he said with wisdom, he said that he's very concerned about leaving a lasting impression with wisdom. How do I ensure that I leave a lasting impression with wisdom? Well, the same thing is with the material possessions. With material possessions, how do I ensure that they make a lasting impression? Even if I want to give it over to the next generation, he's going to have problems with that. But he says, what? I'm gathering all of this stuff so I could barely get any happiness out of it. And I'm going to just end up leaving it to the next person, right? As we know, Judaism does not believe that you could take it with you, right? Material possessions, unlike the pharaohs who desperately tried to bury themselves with all the gold and beer and dogs and all the other things that they tried to bury themselves with and to take it with them to the afterlife. We don't believe that's true. We believe that the afterlife is something much more grand than the material possessions that we try to achieve here in this world. So in the same sense, he's saying, I'm gathering all these things together just to leave over to the person after me. And we're going to jump because it ties into the next verse. I just want to go to the next verse, and that will be our last one for today. And where he says over here, verse 19, again, I know this is quite a bit of text all to do at once, but it's half of what I almost planned to do. So I hope that's a consolation. So verse 19, he says, this person that I'm leaving all my stuff to afterwards, Umiyodea, who knows? Hechacham yihyeh o sachal. Will he be wise or foolish? V'yishlat b'chol amali shal malti. He's going to control all of the things that I worked hard for. V'shechachamti tachat hashamesh, and that I used my wisdom for in this world, for the material. Gam zeh havel. Again, that's also a fleeting thing. I'm worried, I'm concerned, King Solomon says, I'm concerned about not just how I'm going to save myself, but I'm also concerned how I'm going to make a lasting impression. How am I going to ensure that I make a big, I leave over inheritance for the next generation. I make sure that there's plenty for the next generation. Who says that that person's going to be useful, going to be wise about what they do with all this stuff? Maybe they're just going to take it and blow it on I guess the same things that he's bothered that he blew it on, right? Who says that that person is going to be a wise person? And again, that's going to be one of the contrasts between King Solomon's version of achieving material wealth and possessions and your average person. He did it all with wisdom, right? And he was doing it out of research and trying to figure out what true happiness is. Who says the next generation is not just going to go and next you know it's going to be they're going to be in a bad spot because they don't have the wisdom. You can't control whether your children or your the people who are taking care of your assets after your past. You can't control whether they're going to be wise people or not, whether they're going to do what you say. Unfortunately, once a person is not here, they're not here, right? So how are they going to be able to keep on controlling that? Right? It says this person, vayishlat, that person who may be wise, may be foolish, will control b'chol amali shamalti, all that work that I did, v'shechachamti, and all my wisdom that I put together. Right? You can have again a person who is wise, truly wise, and writes everything down. Let's say, and tries and leaves an amazing treasure for the next generation. Well, if the next generation doesn't bother publishing it, no one's going to know about it, right? You're going to be stuck with, I guess, what we would call in Hebrew, mazel, right? It's all going to be based in mazel, whatever your luck was, so to speak. Whatever luck means in Judaism. It's not, we don't really believe in luck and coincidence, but to use the term loosely, you're going to be stuck with the mazel of whatever your mazel was afterwards. So you could be you could be as smart as you want, as you can be, and you could be as wealthy as you can be, but you're going to be stuck with the fact that you don't know who's going to be taking over your assets and all your teachings or whatever it is after a person passes. And that's a depressing feeling, which he's going to speak out more in the next verses, but we're going to have to stop here because I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. But he's going to say that he's not very happy with that, with that reality at this point.
Rabbi,
So again, yeah.
I have a question. How old was he when he wrote this, and how much before this did he die? I mean, after this did he die?
That is a great question, and I don't have that information. I would have to look that up. I would have to see if we even know when that was. That's a good question. Yeah. I have never seen anything about that, how old he was when he wrote the book. But I could try. I'll try to find out. I have to. Yeah. But that would definitely affect how we view these verses. That's a really good point. I didn't think of that. But again, I want to make this clear. He's on the path towards rising up out of this kind of darker place. All right. And we have to understand about the book of Kohelet, the book of Ecclesiastes, is it's not just a depressing book. It is an encouraging book. So what's with all this depressing stuff is that he's coming to a point, and he's actually going to tell us a very important trick to both wisdom and happiness by the end of this chapter, based on how we're reading it. So I think it's definitely worth sticking through this, again, this slow descent over here to see where he comes out with in the end, because it's going to be an interesting turnaround that he's going to do. So, all right, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week. And if you